I always believed that family was the anchor of life. Through storms, through disappointments, through the long nights when everything else seemed to fade, I held on to that idea. I thought that no matter how cruel the world became, the people you raised, the people you loved, the people who shared your blood would never turn against you. I was wrong. If you're listening to this now, it means my body is already in the ground, but my words remain. And before I tell you everything I carried silently for years, I need to take you back. Back to the beginning of how the cracks in my family grew into fractures, and how those fractures widened into a chasm I could never bridge. I was not a perfect person. No, I had flaws like anyone else. But one thing no one could ever accuse me of was neglecting my duty. I worked hard, sometimes 3 jobs at once, just to make sure my children had what they needed. Shoes on their feet, food on the table, a roof that didn't leak. I went without so they could have more. Every parent does that, or at least every parent should. But somewhere along the way my sacrifices became invisible. What was once appreciated became expected and then worse, forgotten. My son Daniel was always the ambitious one. He wanted more than I could give, and in the early years I admired that. He had dreams, drive, determination. I told him, "Go chase the world, son. Don't let anything stop you." But as time went on, I noticed that Daniel's ambition was not about building something with his own 2 hands. It was about cutting corners, taking what wasn't his and then twisting it into a story that made him look like a hero. My daughter, Emily, was softer, gentler, at least when she was young. She used to sit beside me when I came home late from work, her small hands rubbing mine, whispering, "Don't worry, Mom, one day I'll take care of you the way you take care of me." Those words carried me through the hardest nights. But words are fragile things, and promises are even more fragile. Somewhere in her teenage years, Emily's tenderness hardened into resentment. By the time she was an adult, I could see it in her eyes. I was not a mother to be respected. I was a burden, an embarrassment, someone to be tolerated until I no longer stood in the way of her comfort. And then there was my husband, Richard. The man I built my life around, the man I thought would be my companion until the very end. He started as my protector, my partner, but over the years something shifted. He grew colder, distant. The long nights of work, the long silences at the dinner table, they weren't just exhaustion. I came to learn that his heart and eventually his loyalty belonged elsewhere. Betrayal in a marriage is a wound that never fully heals. You might patch it, cover it, pretend it isn't there, but deep down you feel it gnawing at you. So I did what I always did. I endured. I smiled when I wanted to scream, I gave when I had nothing left to give, and I told myself that love would make it all worth it. But love without respect is just chains around the heart. And respect was the first thing they took from me. The years rolled on, and little by little they stopped hiding their disdain. Daniel began making comments about how old-fashioned I was, how I didn't understand the world anymore, how my advice was outdated. Emily stopped visiting as often, always with an excuse. Too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed. But when money was short, or when they needed help with bills, or when something went wrong, suddenly my phone rang. Not with affection. Not with care. But with demands disguised as requests. And Richard? By then he didn't even bother with excuses. Nights away from home became weekends away. Weekends became weeks. Until, eventually, he was little more than a shadow passing through the house we once built together. I learned to live with their absence. What I couldn't live with was their cruelty. There was one night, I remember it too clearly. I had just come back from the hospital, tired and weak from tests. My body wasn't what it used to be, but I didn't want to tell them how sick I felt. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet, if I carried it alone, they wouldn't worry. When I stepped into the kitchen, I heard them, my son, my daughter, my husband, laughing. Laughing at me. "She's losing it," Daniel said. "Did you see how she forgot the name of the medication? She's pathetic." Emily's voice joined in. "She's dragging everything down. If she just went into a home, we'd finally have peace." And Richard, the man I once loved beyond reason, said the words that still cut into me like glass. "Don't worry, it won't be long now. We just need to wait." I stood there, unseen, unheard, while my own family counted the days until I was gone. That was the night I decided I couldn't leave this world silently. If they wanted to erase me, if they wanted to remember me as weak, as pathetic, as nothing, then I would make sure my final act told the truth. That night I started writing. Slowly at first, with shaking hands, but with every word my strength grew. I wrote about the things they thought I'd forgotten, the secrets they thought I'd never learned, the betrayals they thought would stay buried. I wrote not to beg, not to plead, but to reveal. To show them that I was never blind, never foolish, never weak. And most of all, I wrote so that at my funeral, when they gathered pretending to mourn, pretending to care, their masks would finally be ripped away. Because when my body turned to dust, my words would remain. And those words would change everything. The church was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet born from grief. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of people waiting, fidgeting, pretending to mourn while their minds wandered elsewhere. The stained glass windows painted colored shadows across the pews, but not a single person seemed to notice. Their eyes shifted from one another to the coffin at the front, as if even my death had turned into a stage for their performance. Daniel sat near the front, his hands folded too neatly in his lap, his tie perfectly knotted. He had always cared more about appearances than sincerity. His expression was carefully crafted, solemn enough to appear respectful but detached enough to show strength. To anyone watching, he looked like a grieving son. But I knew him better. Behind that mask, his thoughts were cold, calculating, already moving ahead to the next steps. Inheritance papers, property titles, bank accounts. Emily was beside him, her head slightly bowed, but her eyes wandered constantly to the faces in the crowd. She dabbed her cheeks with a handkerchief, though no real tears stained it. She was performing grief like an actress on stage, ensuring everyone could see what a devoted daughter she had been. Every pat on the back, every whispered condolence she received was another chance for her to nod dramatically and sigh, as though her heart was breaking. But her heart had broken for me long before my body gave out. And then there was Richard. My husband, though by the end the word meant little. He sat stiffly, his face blank, as though this entire day was a nuisance, a box to be checked before returning to whatever life he had built outside of me. When the minister spoke my name, he didn't flinch. When they lowered their heads in prayer, his eyes remained open, staring at the floor. His grief had burned out years ago, if it ever truly existed. The rest of the family filled the pews with whispers and stares. Cousins, uncles, distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Some came out of obligation, others out of curiosity. But among the crowd were also those who had long resented me. People who thought I had too much control, too many opinions, too much say in the family matters. I could almost hear their thoughts. Finally. She's gone. Now things can move forward without her interference. Yet there were also a few genuine faces. Mrs. Carter, my neighbor, sat quietly in the corner, her eyes red and swollen. She had seen the way my family treated me, though she never said much. And then there was Michael, my godson, who had always shown me more kindness than my own blood. He sat near the back, his fists clenched, his jaw tight, as if he already sensed that what was about to unfold would not be a normal funeral. The minister's words droned on, the kind of generic phrases spoken at countless funerals. She was loved. She will be missed. Her memory will live on. I wondered how many truly believed those words as they shifted in their seats, checking their watches, waiting for the moment this would all end. But then, just as the service seemed to settle into its routine, the minister cleared his throat and gestured to the side. "Before we conclude," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "there is one final request from the deceased. She left behind a letter to be read here today in front of her family and friends. She wished for her words to be heard in her own way at her own time." A ripple passed through the room. Whispers buzzed instantly, curiosity sparking like fire. "A letter? From me?" I imagined Daniel's stomach tightening, Emily's palms sweating, Richard's throat going dry. Because deep down they must have suspected. They must have known I had seen more than I let on. The minister nodded toward the lawyer seated near the front. A man in a dark suit, carrying a folder embossed with my name, stood slowly. He unfolded the paper with careful precision, his voice calm but firm. "In accordance with her wishes, I will now read the letter she left behind." The room shifted again. Chairs creaked, coughs echoed, and suddenly every eye was locked on the lawyer's hands, on the page he was about to speak from. I could almost feel the tension, heavy as chains. My coffin lay silent at the front, but in that moment I was the loudest voice in the room. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his hands tightening into fists. Emily adjusted her handkerchief, ready to feign another wave of grief if the letter painted her in a glowing light. And Richard, he just stared stone-faced as if daring my words to strike him. But what none of them realized was that the moment that letter was read, every mask they wore would shatter. Their carefully built facades, The lies, the pretenses, the performance of grief. All of it was about to collapse. The lawyer's voice broke the silence. To my family gathered here today. And with that the air shifted. Hearts raced, hands trembled, and the truth I had carried for years was finally free, poised to cut through the room like a blade. This was no longer a funeral. This was a reckoning. To my family gathered here today. The lawyer's voice was steady, but I could feel the unease ripple across the room. Every head tilted slightly forward, every breath seemed to catch. I know you expect words of comfort, words of love, perhaps a farewell filled with kindness, a gentle blessing to ease your grief. But I cannot give you that. Not when so much of my life has been spent in silence, swallowing truths that burned like acid inside me. Today I will not be silent anymore. The room shifted. Some relatives straightened in their seats, eyes darting between Daniel, Emily, and Richard. Others looked down, pretending not to listen, though their ears strained for every syllable. Daniel, my son, the letter began, and I imagined him stiffening, his jaw clenching. You are my blood, my firstborn, the child I carried with pride and hope. I wanted the world for you. I gave everything I could, even when it meant breaking myself to pieces. And how did you repay me? With contempt. With betrayal. Gasps echoed from the pews. Daniel's face flushed red, but he didn't move. You think I didn't know, Daniel? You think I didn't see the money you siphoned from my accounts when I was too weak to argue? You thought I didn't hear the whispers, the lies you spun to paint me as senile, incompetent, so you could take what wasn't yours. You mocked me in my weakness, laughed at the hands that once carried you. You stole from me while pretending to be my protector. The lawyer paused, eyes flicking briefly to Daniel before continuing. You called me pathetic. You told others I was losing my mind. But let me be clear, I was never blind. I was never senile. I was watching. I was listening. And I remembered. The silence that followed was sharp, like the edge of a knife. Daniel shifted in his seat, his fists clenched, his eyes narrowing at the coffin as though he could will me into silence. But the letter went on. Emily, my sweet girl, the lawyer read, his voice softening with the words, though the message was anything but gentle. Do you remember the nights when you promised to take care of me? Do you remember holding my hands and telling me you would never leave me behind? I held on to those promises as my body grew frail, as my bones ached, as loneliness crept into every corner of my life. But promises are fragile, aren't they? You broke yours the moment it became inconvenient. Emily's eyes welled with sudden tears, but not from grief, from exposure. You abandoned me when I needed you most. You left me to sit alone in empty rooms, waiting for a call, a visit, any sign that I still mattered. You mocked me behind closed doors, called me a burden, said I ruined your happiness. You let your friends laugh about me, your co-workers whisper that I was just a senile old woman dragging you down. And still, when your pockets were empty, you came running back, knowing I would give you what I had left. You took my money, my time, my love, and gave me nothing in return but silence and shame. The weight of the words pressed down on the room. No one dared breathe too loudly. Emily pressed the handkerchief hard against her face, but it did nothing to hide the truth. And Richard. The name was enough to turn heads. The lawyer hesitated as though bracing himself. Richard, the man I once believed would be my forever. My partner, my protector, my husband. How foolish I was. I gave you loyalty and you gave me betrayal. I gave you devotion and you gave me distance. You let me waste years of my life clinging to the idea of a marriage that had already died. You thought I didn't know about her, about the nights you spent elsewhere. About the lies you spun so carelessly. But I knew. I always knew. Richard's face remained stone, but a muscle twitched along his jawline. Do you remember the night you said, "It won't be long now, we just need to wait"? I heard you, Richard. I heard every word. I know you counted the days until I would no longer be in your way. You thought my death would free you. But death does not silence truth. Death does not erase betrayal. And today, before everyone gathered here, I want you to know that your mask has been torn away. Whatever life you thought you could live after me, it begins not with freedom but with shame. The murmur of voices grew louder now, the funeral unraveling into whispers and gasps. The air was thick with discomfort, as if the walls themselves trembled with the weight of secrets long buried. But the letter wasn't done. To everyone gathered here, the lawyer continued, his voice rising, you may think you knew me. You may believe the stories my family told about me, that I was weak, senile, a burden. But you are hearing now in my own words the truth. I was none of those things. I was strong enough to endure their cruelty. I was clear enough to see through their lies. And I was wise enough to leave behind the truth they could never bury. The lawyer folded the first page, set it aside, and picked up the next. This is only the beginning. The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Faces turned pale. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats as though wishing they had never come. But it was too late. The coffin at the front remained still, silent, yet in that moment I was more alive than I had been in years. My voice filled the room. My truth carved into their souls. And everyone knew, this was not a farewell. This was an unmasking. The lawyer's voice trembled slightly as he turned to the next page, and though he tried to hide it, the weight of the words he carried was already altering the air around him. The silence in the church was alive now, thick, restless, heavy with dread. My children, the letter continued, and my husband, you may have thought my mind was slipping. You whispered it often enough. But in truth, while you dismissed me as fragile, I was documenting, recording, remembering. Every word you spoke, every cruel laugh, every betrayal you thought slipped unnoticed into the night. I gathered it like a gardener gathers weeds, pulling them into my hands until I could finally expose them to the light. The lawyer cleared his throat, scanning the page, then continued. Daniel, do you recall the day you came into my home with those documents you said I should sign? Do you remember how you told me it was just routine, that it would make things easier if something happened to me? You smiled, reassuring me like a child trying to trick his teacher. But I wasn't fooled. You forged my signature on more than one occasion. You drained accounts I had built with sweat and sacrifice, and you gambled them away on ventures you boasted would make you rich. You did not just betray me, son. You betrayed the very lessons I tried to instill in you about honesty, about building a life with integrity. Daniel's face was a storm. He shifted violently in his seat and someone behind him whispered, Forged? Did she say forged? The lawyer's voice pressed on, implacable. And Emily, my darling girl, I know you told others I was losing my memory. You told your friends that I sat confused, muttering names that made no sense. You called me a burden, a weight around your neck. But do you remember that night in the hospital when you were supposed to visit me? You posted a picture online instead, laughing with your friends at a pool party, mocking me in your caption. Finally free from the drama queen. You didn't know I would see it. You didn't know a nurse would show me your post, thinking it would explain why my daughter hadn't come to my bedside. The shame didn't kill me then. But it lit a fire in me. A fire that kept me writing. Emily's sobs broke the air, raw and unrestrained now. Her handkerchief trembled in her fingers. But sympathy was scarce in the room. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, heads shaking, eyes narrowing at her exposed cruelty. And Richard, the lawyer paused, the weight of the name sinking like an anchor. You thought you were clever. That your absences were unnoticed, that your lies were seamless. But I kept the receipts, Richard. Hotel bills, charges on our shared accounts, gifts purchased that I never received. And beyond your betrayal of me as a wife, there was your betrayal as a father. Do you remember telling Daniel and Emily that my illness was exaggerated, that I was playing victim, that soon they would be free of me? They believed you. They repeated your words, poisoning themselves against me. You didn't just abandon me, you taught our children how to despise me. A murmur of outrage filled the church now, a ripple of disgust that spread from pew to pew. Some people turned to glare at Richard directly, others shook their heads in disbelief. But Richard remained rigid, jaw locked, face pale, his pride the only armor he had left. The lawyer's voice steadied and grew louder. Make no mistake, I am not writing these words to wallow in pain. I am writing them to cut through the lies that have chained me in silence. Each of you wore masks in life. Masks of devotion, masks of loyalty, masks of respect. But here before everyone I am pulling those masks away. And what remains is the truth. The air was suffocating. No cough, no shuffle, no whisper could break the spell of the letter now. The lawyer turned the page once more. There were nights I prayed for change. Nights I told myself that love could heal even the deepest betrayals. But love without respect is nothing but a leash around the neck. And I will not carry that leash into eternity. So hear me now, I forgive none of you. My silence was mistaken for weakness. Today you will learn it was strength. Gasps erupted. A few older relatives clasped their mouths, scandalized by the cold finality of those words. Others looked grim, almost satisfied to hear long-suspected truths confirmed. But the letter did not end there. To those of you who sit here today pretending grief, know that I see through you too. I hear the whispers that have followed me for years. That I was controlling. That I was difficult. That I demanded too much. And maybe some of that is true. But I was never undeserving of love. I was never undeserving of care. And yet that is what was stolen from me. The basic dignity owed to any human being. Today I take it back with my voice. The lawyer paused, letting the words settle like ashes over the stunned crowd. This, he said finally, his voice catching slightly, is not the end of the letter. There is more, much more. She wanted the truth not only spoken but acted upon. And in her final instructions she left behind evidence, documents, and declarations that will change everything you thought was yours. A collective gasp filled the air. Daniel's head snapped toward the lawyer. Emily's sobs turned into sharp breaths. Richard's pale face flushed with sudden anger. And from the back row, Michael, my godson, the one person who had always been loyal, sat straighter, his eyes wide with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. The funeral had begun as a performance of grief. Now it had transformed into a courtroom, a stage, a reckoning. And I, though lying silent in my coffin, was holding every string. The lawyer inhaled slowly before lifting the next page of my letter. His hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the knowledge of what he was about to unleash. The church, moments ago filled with whispers, now sat in pin-drop silence. "Hi family," the letter continued, "you may be asking why I chose to air these truths now in front of everyone. You may think this is cruelty, one final act of spite. But you misunderstand me. This is not spite, it is justice. And justice, though late, is still justice." The lawyer's eyes swept the crowd, then fell back to the page. "Daniel, Emily, Richard, you gathered here today expecting to leave with more than condolences. You expected papers to sign, assets to divide, accounts to inherit. You thought this funeral would end with wealth in your pockets, riches on your tongues, and my memory buried alongside my body. But you were wrong. Dead wrong." A collective gasp broke out across the pews. Daniel stiffened, his fists tightening against his knees. Emily's face drained of color. Richard's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The lawyer pressed on. "I leave you nothing." The words cracked like thunder through the room. A cry rang out, half shock, half outrage, from somewhere near the front. "You heard me," the letter declared. "Nothing. Not a cent. Not a house. Not a ring, a chair, a photograph. The inheritance you so eagerly anticipated will never pass into your hands. You will inherit only the truth I leave behind, and the weight of the shame I have carried in silence." Daniel shot to his feet, his voice trembling with fury. "This is a lie. She wouldn't, she couldn't." His outburst echoed against the stained glass windows, but the lawyer ignored him, his voice steady. "Instead," the letter continued, "everything I owned, every dollar, every possession, every property has been given to those who knew the meaning of loyalty. To those who stood by me when you abandoned me. To those who gave love without condition, when my own blood offered only disdain." The room stirred violently. Eyes darted to the back pew where Michael, my godson, sat frozen, his chest rising and falling in disbelief. He shook his head slowly as if afraid to believe what he suspected was true. "Yes, Michael," the letter said, as though I could see the shock on his face even from beyond the grave. "You were the son I deserved, though not the one I bore. When I was alone you came. When I was hungry you fed me. When my body was weak you carried me. You showed me what love without condition looks like. And so, everything I leave behind, my estate, my savings, my home, belongs to you." A gasp swept through the church like a storm. Michael's hands flew to his mouth, his eyes wide with disbelief. Daniel's face turned crimson, his voice erupting with rage. "This is fraud. This is manipulation." He turned toward the lawyer, shouting. "She was old. She didn't know what she was doing. You tricked her." But the lawyer lifted his hand calmly, cutting him off. "She anticipated you would say this," he said. Then reading from the letter. "Daniel, I know you will accuse me of senility, of confusion, of being coerced. That is why, before I wrote these words, I sat with doctors, lawyers, and witnesses. Every decision, every paper, every will was made with full clarity, documented and sealed. Your accusations mean nothing now. The evidence is already with the courts. Daniel collapsed back into the pew, his fury boiling but contained by the stares of everyone around him. The letter turned sharper than a blade. And Richard, it continued, do not think you will walk free of this either. I have gathered everything, proof of your infidelity, your theft, your schemes. Copies have been given to my lawyer, to Michael, and to the authorities. By the time you leave this church, investigations will already have begun. The life you thought you would enjoy without me will not be a life of freedom. It will be a life of consequences. Gasps and murmurs rose again. Richard's face went pale, beads of sweat forming at his temple. He shifted in his seat, jaw working, but he said nothing. For once, silence was his only weapon. And Emily, the letter continued, its voice quieter now but no less cutting. You wanted to be free of me? You have your wish. You will not inherit my burden, my wealth, or my memory. You will inherit only the knowledge that kindness could have been your salvation, but cruelty was your choice. Live with that truth, for it will follow you longer than money ever could. Emily broke into sobs, loud and messy, no longer the graceful performance she had started the day with. But sympathy in the room had died. The faces around her were not pitying now, they were condemning. The lawyer set the letter down for a moment, letting the storm in the room churn. The weight of my words pressed on everyone's chest. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others stared openly at Daniel, Emily, and Richard with disgust. But there was one final twist. The lawyer lifted the last page of that section. And to those who doubt me, to those who think this is only the bitterness of a dying woman, let me say this. In the safe deposit box you will find today are bank statements, forged documents, photographs, receipts, and recordings. Evidence of every betrayal I endured. Evidence that will outlive even this letter. By the time you walk out of this church, the law will already be moving. My death is not your freedom, it is your trial. The church erupted. Some guests gasped, others muttered furiously, a few even stood to leave, unwilling to witness the collapse of a family laid bare. But no one could escape the truth. Daniel sat stunned, trembling with fury. Emily cried, her body folding into itself. Richard, stone-faced, stared at the floor, knowing the cage was already closing in around him. And in the back, Michael sat frozen, torn between gratitude and grief, realizing the responsibility and the vengeance that had been placed upon his shoulders. The lawyer folded the final page of that section and set it down. His voice was low but clear as he spoke the last words of the letter aloud. My death is not the end. It is the beginning of your reckoning. The lawyer's final words hung in the air like smoke, curling around every corner of the church. No hymn, no prayer, no polite speech could sweep them away. For a moment the silence was absolute. A silence so deep that even the creak of the old wooden pews felt deafening. And then chaos. Daniel shot to his feet, his face twisted in rage. This is a setup. Do you all hear me? A setup. His voice cracked, the composure he had worn all day now shattered beyond repair. He pointed toward the coffin at the front, his finger trembling. She's gone. She can't do this to me. She can't. But the crowd didn't see a grieving son anymore. They saw a thief exposed, a man stripped of his mask. Heads shook in disgust. Murmurs filled the air. Forgery? Fraud? Stealing from his own mother? Daniel's reputation unraveled in real time, and the more he shouted, the more his words sounded like desperation, not defense. Emily's sobs were loud, uncontrolled. She buried her face in her hands, but nothing could hide the truth now. The whispers around her burned hotter than fire. She mocked her mother? She abandoned her? She posted about it? A few guests even shifted away from her on the pew, as if her shame might stain them by proximity. And Richard remained seated, but his stillness was not strength. It was fear. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the floor, and beads of sweat rolled down his temple. He knew the evidence was real. He knew the investigations had already begun. He was a man watching the walls of his carefully built life crumble in slow motion. At the back of the church, Michael sat frozen. The weight of what he had just heard settled on his shoulders like lead. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to inherit not just possessions, but a legacy of truth, of vengeance, of final justice. His hands trembled, not from greed or shock, but from the realization that someone had loved him enough to entrust him with everything. The guests, friends, neighbors, distant relatives, shifted uneasily. This was no longer a funeral. It was a courtroom, a public execution of pride and pretense. Some looked at the coffin with awe, as though I were still alive, orchestrating every gasp, every broken tear, every ruined reputation. And in a way I was. The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice low and respectful now. These were her final words. With this, the letter concludes. But the letter didn't truly end. It lived in their minds, in the cracks it carved into their lives. Daniel collapsed back into his seat, his body shaking with silent fury. Emily clung to her handkerchief, her sobs softening into broken whimpers. Richard finally raised his head, his eyes scanning the crowd, searching for a sliver of sympathy. He found none. One by one the guests began to leave. Some left quickly, unable to stomach the destruction they had just witnessed. Others lingered, whispering to each other, glancing back at the disgraced family. Every departing step echoed with judgment. The church grew emptier, but the weight of my words remained heavier than stone. Michael stayed behind. He walked slowly to the front, his eyes fixed on the coffin. He laid his hand gently against the polished wood, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," he said, though his words trembled with both grief and gratitude. "I'll take care of it. I promise." His promise was simple, but it was more than Daniel, Emily, or Richard had ever given me. As the last of the guests departed, the family sat alone in the ruins of their carefully constructed masks. Daniel's anger, Emily's shame, Richard's fear. They no longer looked like mourners. They looked like criminals exposed. And though my body lay cold in the coffin, my presence filled the room. My words were still in the air, crawling into their skin, pressing into their bones. They could not escape me. They never would. Because revenge is not always a shouted curse or a violent act. Sometimes, revenge is simply the truth spoken at the right moment in the right place when there is no one left to silence it. That was my gift to myself. And my curse upon them. In the weeks that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. Daniel's business partners pulled away, unwilling to be associated with a man accused of forgery and fraud. Emily's friends vanished, her reputation destroyed by the cruelty she could no longer deny. And Richard, his world collapsed in the hands of investigators, every secret affair, every financial scheme dragged into the light. The inheritance they had waited for never came. Instead they inherited shame, loneliness, and the knowledge that in the end I had the last word. And Michael, the one who had never abandoned me, carried forward the legacy I chose to give. He honored it not with greed but with gratitude. He proved that love, once given, can echo beyond the grave just as loudly as betrayal. So when you hear my story, remember this: the dead are not silent. Not if they refuse to be. And sometimes the most powerful revenge does not come in life, but in the haunting that lingers after death. At my funeral they thought they were burying me. But in truth I was burying them.